Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Troy Swanson. I am the library department chair. I apologize to everybody for the mix-up on the links. Unfortunately, I have to admit that's not the first time I've done that for these events, so eventually we'll get it right. Thank you for everyone's patience and diligence in getting in. I am super excited about today's event entitled Chicago's Arab Americans, featuring Dr. Nina Shoman-Dajani. We have had many years of celebrating our Arab and Muslim students on campus, and so our library, I think, has been proud to be a platform for these discussions. Nina has been a longtime friend and presenter and a real advocate on our campus, and so I appreciate her time. She's done research into Arab American students and brings a lot of wealth and personal experience to this talk, so she is the right person to have today. So Nina, I want to thank you so much for doing this, and especially doing it during Ramadan, so I hope your voice holds out. Thank you so much. With that, I will be quiet and mute myself and turn it over to Nina. So thank you all.
Thanks so much, Troy. Excited to do this again. Happy to be here and share this information with you all and connect with new colleagues as well in this virtual setting. Today's presentation, as you know, is about Chicago's Arab Americans. It is Arab Heritage Month. I'm excited to share this information with you. But before we get into all of the details of today's presentation, I wanted to share a little bit about myself. I thought that it would be nice for us to drop something in the chat. Maybe your name should be listed, but if you want to share your name, your affiliation with the college here, if you're a faculty member, staff, instructor, what department you do work in, and that'll give me a chance to have an idea of who attended today. If you're wondering who I am, if we have not had a chance to connect, or you're not one of my colleagues that works with me in the department or hasn't worked with me in the past, here's a little bit about myself. As was mentioned, I am the Assistant Dean in Learning Enrichment and College Readiness. I've been at Marine for about 13 years now, and I also teach classes at St. Xavier and UIC in Arab American Studies and in Middle Eastern Studies. I won't get into all the details about my educational background. It's listed there for you, but just a few important things that I want to note. And these photos here kind of tell a little bit about my background. I'm a first-generation Arab American. My parents are of Palestinian heritage and raised 7 kids to be very proud of their Palestinian heritage and ancestry. My father, who's in this photo at the top, raised us, bringing us to cultural events and advocating for Palestine. And so I am very passionate about my background, and I'm happy to share a little bit about that with you all today. There's also a photo of my family with my mom in there as well. And I included that because it's very important to me as an Arab American to not only share my my culture with my colleagues and my community, but to instill in my children their heritage as well, just as it was instilled in me. And the last photo is just a photo of me when I had received an award from the State Treasurer's Office for contributions to education in the state of Illinois. I sit on various boards, national and regional, and some of those are listed here at the bottom. And as you know already, because Troy mentioned it, I am the advisor to the Arab Student Union and have served as an advocate for underserved and marginalized students for many years here at the college. And I hope that we can work together to continue that work. So as I mentioned, it's Arab Heritage Month, and there has been many proclamations that have come out in the last couple weeks from all states, well, almost all states. I know Illinois has participated by issuing a proclamation. This is a letter that was issued by our President Joe Biden in support of Arab Heritage Month, and also recognizing that many Arab Americans have contributed to this country, the history of this nation, and continue to fight discrimination and bias and violence in our communities as well. So I'll leave that up there for you to take a look at for a moment. I don't have time to read it, but I'd be happy to share it with you after the presentation. And I want to apologize in advance if I'm talking too fast. It's just that we have limited time, and this is a very big topic that we have a very short amount of time to focus on. So I'd be happy to elaborate and continue these discussions offline if you have questions that we don't get through today. So before we jump into who are Chicago's Arab Americans and who makes up this community, what have Arab Americans contributed to Chicago and surrounding areas, I think it's important for us to talk a little bit about the region in which Arabs come from. There are some words, terminology that I'll go over in just a moment, but there is a difference between the terms the Middle East or the Arab world. You might hear these terms used in the news or in publications synonymously, but they do not mean the same thing. The Middle East is a region that includes the 22 Arab nations that belong to the League of Arab Nations and are listed here at the bottom of the slide. But the Middle East also includes Iran, Israel, and Turkey. And so these are non-Arabic speaking states or nations or territories in which belong to the geographical area of the Middle East, but are not specifically, that would not be specific to the Arab world. I do also want to recognize that within the Arab world, Palestine, which is an Arabic speaking nation, also is part of the League of Arab Nations, as well as some territories or countries that you may not have been aware are also considered Arab countries. And those include the Comoros Islands and Somalia, Djibouti. And that just means that they're not only part of the League of Arab Nations, but their governments have decided that Arabic is one of their national languages. I do also want to note that not everyone that lives in an Arabic-speaking country or Muslim majority country in the Middle East or Arab world is of Arab heritage. There are many minority groups and various historical tribes and groups that have lived in this region for many, many years, for many decades, and that have maintained their own distinct culture, language, or dialect. So those terms I had referenced, you may hear this community referring to themselves as Middle Eastern or from the Middle East or Middle Eastern and North African, which would also have the acronym MENA, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. You may also hear people from the Middle East or Arab world refer to themselves as coming from the SWANA region. SWANA stands for Southwest Asian and North African. Also, some Arabs in our community might refer to themselves as Arab Americans or just as Arab. And also I want to make a very important note that not all Arabs are Muslim and not all Muslims are Arab. Islam is the faith that Muslims adhere to, but not all Arabs are Muslim, and many Arabs are Christian and belong to various denominations. So when we talk about Chicago's Arab Americans, there are many, many topics that we can cover. I just wrapped up a class at St. Xavier last semester that I taught for the first time called Chicago's Arab Americans. And for many years, I taught a class there called Middle Eastern American Issues, which was really a class that focused on Arab American issues or issues that Arab Americans face in the United States. But last semester, we launched a new class that focused only on Arab Americans in Chicago. So that was pretty cool. And there were many, many topics that we covered in that class, some of which are listed here. So in addition to these topics that I've listed here, I'm sure many of you can think of many other topics that relate to this community, but everything from Arab American youth in Chicago, racial identity construction, the many poets, artists, and influencers that come from the Arab community. These are topics in and of themselves that we can do presentations on, but we don't have time to do that today. So you're just going to kind of get the snapshot version of the class that I taught last semester at St. Xavier. So my research historically has been on racial identity construction of Arab American college students. For those of us that are working in higher education, that are advocates of college students, we many times look into the research of those student subpopulations that we serve. And as I was working on my doctorate, one of the things I noticed is that there's a gap in research on Arab American college students. And much of that has to do with the status that the federal government has designated the racial status of the federal government has designated to this community, in which this community is still known on the US Census as white. However, because Arab Americans and many people from the Middle East do not necessarily identify with that term, and I won't talk about, racial construction and how this terminology came about in the US Census in the first place, because we don't have time for that today. But in other presentations, I've done that. But because of this designation that has been then adopted by higher ed institutions across the country, we do not have a clear picture of who our Arab students are on campus, who the MENA population is, the Middle Eastern North African population is on campus. Thankfully, our college, Moraine Valley, has just adopted this new category, MENA, on our college applications last year. So we're now starting to get a little bit more data on this population, but historically we did not have it. And I wanted to fill a gap in that research and give a voice to the student population, especially for higher ed practitioners that work at institutions that have such large Arab student populations like Moraine Valley. Historically, as Tori had mentioned in the intro, our Arab students have been active on campus. They've been in the library doing presentations. They've brought many speakers to campus. They've served as student trustees. And I've served as the Arab Student Union advisor for over a decade now. So I've had the pleasure of working with many, many students through the years that are maybe first, second, third generation Arab Americans, or that may be new arrivals to this country. And those of you that are teachers on campus have them in your classroom. So you're very much familiar with this population being students in your rooms. Few more pictures. I, am a researcher and an administrator, so many times we focus on data and we focus on the numbers and we focus on the information, but I really don't like to talk about a student subpopulation without giving you a picture of who they are, sharing their faces and humanizing the presentation. So that's why I'd like to incorporate photos in the presentation. And these are some photos of some of our students and some of our speakers that have been on campus. And there's actually a panel there that took place in the library during Women's History Month a couple of years ago. That was a really, really well-attended panel. I hope we can do that again in the future. So let's talk about Arab Americans and their historical migration patterns here in the United States, to the United States, what brought them here. And then once we set that foundation, we'll be able to talk more about their experiences here in Chicago. So in the 1800s, Arabs started to migrate to the United States. They came mainly from what is now known as present-day Lebanon and Syria. And you'll see some photos that are incorporated in this presentation that come from archives, many of which come from the Arab American National Museum, which is in Detroit, Michigan, or that have been in publications that discuss Arab Americans or various books. Like many other groups that came to the United States, Arab Americans came looking for opportunities, or that many of them were escaping war or a crisis in their country. Some of them planned to come only temporarily and then ended up settling with their families and staying here for generations. In the 1800s, those that were mainly coming were escaping Ottoman taxation or inscription. They were seeing changes in the region. You have to understand also that the Middle East and Arab world is a formerly colonized area. Their borders and those that are in power are the residual effects of colonization. And so the political climate in the region then and now, to some extent, is very much one of the major influences of leaving the region. Now, there is some basic information and data that we do get from the US Census. This is what I like to call extremely inaccurate data that we still utilize because it's all we have. The latest census in 2020, we're still compiling that information and waiting for the US Census to release some of the demographic information that was collected. But the Arab American Institute, which is one of the largest Arab American run think tanks in Washington, D.C., runs also some demographic searches and surveys across the states that we get some data from, and then the American Community Survey, which is another survey that the U.S. Census does, provides us with some information. So although some of this information is dated, it is what we have, so I'm going to share some of that with you. We know that there's at least 1.7 million Arab Americans living in the United States based on U.S. Census data. Now, again, that's a huge underestimate. The Arab American Institute estimates that there's at least 3.6 million Arab Americans. I feel comfortable saying that that number is also a huge underestimation, and that it's probably closer to double that. One thing we do know for sure, though, that is that there are large concentrations of Arab Americans living in many major cities that you are familiar with, ranging from Los Angeles to New York and New Jersey to Chicago, Washington, D.C. There are Arab Americans in all 50 states, but they do tend to gather in more urban areas. As I mentioned, Arabs do trace their heritage to 22 different nations, but the majority of those in the United States are from Lebanon, Egypt, Syria, Palestine, Morocco, Iraq, Yemen, and Jordan. So as we talk about the history of Arab Americans nationally and in Chicago, I like to kind of infuse some of these photos that I call then and now. The characteristics of the community have remained the same to a certain extent, but have changed drastically as well. As generations grow and continue to prosper from all ethnic and racial groups, we know that their experiences change, that with upward mobility, their experiences and the class system that exists in the United States changes. But one of the things that stays constant that I have seen and that researchers have noted is that Arab American heritage and culture passed down from generation to generation is something that's very, very important and is something that is very much valued. Here are a couple of photos, one from an old gathering here in Chicago some decades ago, and then a newer photo with maybe some familiar faces to some of you that are in our community. But you can see here that these women gathered for a protest downtown, and you can tell by the sign that they're holding, and many of them are part of the Women's Committee, which is associated with the Arab American Action Network. The link that I have here, we don't have time to show the article, but there was a really good article that came out in the Chicago Reporter, and I could send you those links after the presentation. And that article was about, they call it Little Palestine. And so many of you may know this, but perhaps you don't if you're new to the area, but the southwest suburbs that kind of surround the Moraine Valley area, Worth, Hickory Hills, Bridgeview, all are considered part of what we refer to as Little Palestine. And it doesn't take much for us to figure this out. If you just drive down to Harlem, you can see many Middle Eastern and Arab owned restaurants. You can see bakeries, cafes, grocery stores that are owned by Arabs in our community. And many of those Arabs come from Palestine. And so we tend to call the area Little Palestine. So let's get back to immigration patterns. Some of these photos for you historians may look familiar. As I mentioned, there were Arabs that started to immigrate to the United States in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Most of them, the vast majority of them at that time, were Christian, again, from present-day Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. And eventually, as they came to the city and decided to settle, many of them coming to Chicago's the World Fair and exhibition for the first time to share their culture, and then they ended up staying here, concentrated their communities in the Douglas Park area. And then we see some movement around Chicago. They weren't only in one specific area, but there were concentrations of the community in specific areas. Today, we see Chicago's Arab Americans living throughout the Chicagoland area, not only in the southwest suburbs. Of course, we're kind of focusing on that area today because of the historical migration patterns of Arab Americans from Chicago to the southwest suburbs. But I do want to note that there are Arab Americans living on the far north side of Chicago, in the northwest suburbs, in the west suburbs, downtown Chicago, and in some of the rural areas as well. Now, in post-World War II days, more and more Arab immigration, we start to see more and more Arab immigration. The diversity of Arabs that are coming also changes the demographics change. They're not only coming from Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, and surrounding areas that we considered the greater Syria area. They are coming from North Africa, and some also from Saudi and some of the other surrounding areas, but mainly still coming from the region of Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, and then some more immigration coming from Egypt and North African countries. Because of the crisis in Palestine and the huge refugee influx that we see in the surrounding Arab countries, and the diaspora stretches as far as South and Central America, and throughout Europe, we also see an influx of Palestinians coming as a result of the 1948 and 1967 wars. Many of these Arabs that are coming to Chicago specifically are moving into what's considered transitional neighborhoods. By the 70s, Arabs are mainly living in the Gage Park, Chicagoland, Marquette Park area. And what they're experiencing here is the same thing that everyone else in the region is also experiencing. You see this familiar photo of Martin Luther King during his visit to Chicago. Those Arabs that are living in the area are also experiencing the same changes in the city, the racism and tension that's also being experienced by minority groups in the city, mainly African Americans. And also you'll see now how this influences some of the movement that they make to the suburbs. So initial migration was of wealthier, more well-to-do Arab Americans coming from the city to the suburbs, many of which made their money by owning stores, small storefronts in the city. Many of them came from background of or generations prior to them working as peddlers through the city, even working door to door, and then eventually earning enough money to open stores. They made quite a good living, or at least a living that was well enough for them to move out to the suburbs and to buy a piece of land, either a home with land on it, or a small backyard. Or some of them moved into multi-generational buildings where there may have been 4 apartments or condos, and the family shared that to keep the family together. And it may have been siblings with multiple children living in each apartment or condo. And then we see that more and more working class Arabs are able to make it out to the suburbs by the 1990s. And then many of the Chicagoland community had moved out completely from the area that we know today as Gage Park, Marquette Park, the 63rd and Kedzie area, where the Arab American Action Network was established. And I'll touch on that organization in a few minutes. There are still a handful of families that live in the 63rd and Kedzie area, that historic port of Arab Americans, but most of them have moved out to the suburbs now. And those that are living now in the city tend to be a new generation of professionals that are living in the South Loop and West Loop and downtown and various areas. Now, this is some data that I do want to share. This comes from a committee that I'm part of, but was also collected by mainly Louise Kankar, who is a leading scholar in Arab Americans and Muslim Americans in the Chicagoland area. She's a mentor and professor who works at Marquette University. I was also the director on my dissertation committee, so I owe her a lot of credit for getting me through that. This information here, I won't go through all of it because it's a lot of data, but I do want to point out that much of this information comes from the American Community Survey, the U.S. Census Bureau, and based on that data, we know that Illinois ranks 3rd, 4th, and 5th nationally for various Arab groups, but that it is the 2nd largest home to Palestinians, Assyrians, Jordanians in the United States. The Palestinian community is one of the largest communities in Chicago, and we tend to believe that the largest concentration of Palestinians is in Chicago. There are larger Arab American communities in different states, California, for example, but concentration-wise, we believe that Palestinians make up the vast majority of Arabs in Chicago, and the largest U.S. concentration of Palestinians is in Chicago. I also want to note that the Chicago metropolitan area has other non-Arab, but from the Arab region populations, including Assyrians and Chaldeans. And so, as I mentioned earlier, there are other minority groups that have historically come from the region that don't necessarily identify as Arab, and I want to make sure that we are aware of that. Another article that was published, almost 10 years ago, but seems like yesterday, was titled "Forget Polls, Palestinians Find a Home in Suburban Chicago." And I also have the link to that article, and I can share that with you. This photo here is of the Prayer Center, which is the mosque in Orland Park. It was built in 2004. Rarely is a mosque built in any suburban community in the United States without controversy. This is something that Muslim communities across the country continue to struggle with, is the want or need for a mosque in their community, and then it being challenged by other members of their community. And this Orland Park mosque also did face many challenges when it was being built, but it was built, and it's a beautiful mosque. And they've now also added this building to the left, which is known as the Quran Academy. And it is the local mosque for the Orland Park area, but many people from surrounding areas also attend this mosque. And many of you probably that are part of the Muslim or Arab community joining us today have come to that mosque. It's really a beautiful, beautiful building. Many of our administrators from Moraine Valley have also visited the mosque. There's typically a community gathering every year in which Moraine Valley ELT members and other staff are invited. So it's really nice to have seen and been with some of my colleagues here on campus at the mosque, so they can experience that as well. There's a few other sites where you can get demographic information about Arab Americans. One of them is the Yalla Count Me In campaign site. Yalla Count Me In. So Yalla is the Arabic word for let's go. So if you ever hear students on campus in passing say Yalla, that just means let's go. Or it's a word that you can use in your classroom when you want your students to kind of get going, or it's time for them to get out of class. You can just tell them Yalla. Maybe you can surprise them with that. Kind of throw them off if you're not a native Arabic speaker, so that would be fun. But Yalla Count Me In was a campaign that was based around the U.S. Census, and a lot of advocacy that came out of the Arab American Institute to motivate Arab Americans to participate in the U.S. Census, one, but also not to check the white box and to list their country of origin so that we can start to collect better demographic information about the community. Here is a general chart of population growth in Illinois. Again, I think it's a big underestimate, but these are some charts that we have access to, so I wanted to share them, mainly because it shows the growth of the community. Despite what the numbers are, there has been growth in the community. We've seen that regionally, locally, and although Illinois doesn't have the largest Arab American population in the United States, it does have a growing population. And we can't talk about the Arab American community in Chicago or in the United States in general without also discussing the challenges of living Arab or Muslim in America. As I noted before, you can be Muslim, of course, and not be Arab. The majority of Muslims in this country are actually not Arab. The majority of Muslims in this country come from many different groups. The largest Muslim American population in the United States is actually African American. There's many Southwest Asian Muslims in this country as well as Muslims that are Latino and from all different backgrounds. The vast majority of Arab Americans, now listen closely, this always shocks everybody. The vast majority of Arab Americans that live in the United States are not Muslim, they are Christian. And so if you remember back towards the beginning of my presentation, I noted that the majority of those coming in the late 1800s and early 1900s were Lebanese and Syrian, what we know today as Lebanon and Syria, Christians. And so we now have generations, over 100 years of generation of Lebanese and Syrian Christians that have been in this country for a very long time. And the majority of Muslims from Arab countries started to mainly come in the mid 1900s and some in the early 1900s. And I'm going to tell you the story about some of those that came to Chicago specifically in the late 1800s and early 1900s. But it was more common for Christian Arabs to come in the early 1900s. These are some headlines and also the cover of a film that came out about surveillance of the Arab and Muslim community. This film right here, The Feeling of Being Watched, came out a few years ago, and it's riveting. I wish we can get access to this in the library. By the way, Troy, if we can order this for the library, it would be great. The Feeling of Being Watched is about an FBI surveillance campaign that took place and probably continues to take place in the Bridgeview community, mainly to watch the Muslim, or 100% to watch the Muslim community there and to surveil the community. Surveillance of minority groups in the United States is not something that is uncommon. Historically, this is something that has been, known, and we won't get into all of that today, but for the purposes of today's presentation, I do want to note that discrimination, hate crimes, surveillance, and anti-Arab racism are all some of the challenges that this community continues to deal with. In my research that I conducted on Arab American college students, which was supposed to focus on how their lived experiences as Arab Americans contributed to their racial identity or their identity as Arab Americans, one of the things that I found was that all of the students that I had interviewed that came from various backgrounds and various faith backgrounds, and from some were community college students, some were university students, and they ranged in age from 19 to 26. At the time that I did the research was several years ago. They were children when September 11th happened. And although I didn't have any questions in my research about 9/11 or the effects of 9/11 on their lives, when I asked them about events or circumstances that may have influenced their identity or how they think about their identity, every single one of them brought up 9/11. Either they as children had identified with a discriminatory act, or they witnessed a hate crime of a family member, or they witnessed their mom being harassed because she might wear the hijab, or they were shunned by their friends because of their Arab or Muslim background. But that was one of the things that I wasn't shocked that it came out, but it really made me think a lot about the trauma that children endured after September 11th in this country who were Muslim or Arab heritage. And that's something for us to continue to think about when we think about the children, the students that are in our classroom, and some of the experience that they might have had outside the classroom or even on campus, and think about the sensitivity that we show towards those populations. One of the other issues that Arab Americans have faced, and as I mentioned, because of the issue with the category of MENA or Arab American not being on the US Census, the data about this population is many times not apparent, it's not available, and that is not only in higher ed, but also in healthcare. And when much of the data is collected about poverty rates, we can't see this population on paper. They are included in the white category. So sometimes we don't have data or accurate data on the needs of this population. There was a huge campaign, and there has been for the last 20 years, to have MENA, Middle Eastern North African, added to the US Census. The US Census Bureau has tested the category successfully, and we're very close to adding it to the last US Census. But when the final decisions around adding that category to the census were being made, that's also when former President Trump was brought into office, and he disagreed with that new category, and his office decided to let the Office of Management and Budget, who's over the U.S. Census, table that, get rid of it. It wasn't a topic of discussion anymore. So we're hoping that by 2030, we will see a new category. But meanwhile, organizations are advocating and continuing to advocate for this community in various ways. And this photo here shows, and I have the link here as well. It was a news, it was not a news article, it was actually a newscast about Arab Americans not being counted in COVID vaccine data. And as you know, minority communities have been greatly affected by the pandemic in ways that other communities have not. But we weren't able to collect data on the Arab and Middle Eastern community. And so some of the local organizations, including the Arab American Family Services Social Service Agency that is actually right down the street from us in Worth, advocated for this and worked with at the state level to get Arab Americans counted when they get their vaccine. So although that decision was made late, it was made. And so there will be a little bit of data about vaccination status for this community that can be now used in future research and when reporting on COVID vaccine status. But this was a huge, it was a huge campaign and a huge success. And it goes to show you that when advocating for these things, although it can be challenging and many lawmakers don't want to hear it, sometimes we're able to open doors and be counted. So we've seen that now at Moraine after many years of advocacy for the MENA category, not only credited to the Arab American colleagues here on campus that advocated for that, but the many, many colleagues from various departments and various diverse backgrounds that also advocated for that. We're making progress. So I want to talk a little bit about contributions of Arab Americans. You know, there's bits and pieces of information that we can gather about Arabs in Chicago that not only come from, you know, the general Census Bureau data or from some articles that have come out, but also the research that's been conducted on this community, and also from some of our agencies in the region that have been around for a long time. But there was also a little bit of information that we're able to pull from the whole house. And based, I have a note here, so I'm gonna kind of look away from the camera. I want to make sure that I'm reading this accurately. It was noted in records that are maintained by the whole house in Chicago that Chicago Arabs were living around Polk Street and near Canal Street as well. So again, this is something that wasn't referenced prior, but according to records at the whole house, there were also Arab communities living near Canal and Polk Street. They eventually did join the fabric of other communities. Many, as I had noted earlier, were drawn here for education purposes, for economic reasons, but many of them came as part of the World's Fairs and for economic opportunity via the World's Fair, including Chicago's 1893 World's Columbian Exposition. And I do want to note, you know, this historic population here in Chicago has contributed in many different ways. And I want to just specifically focus on, you know, professional ways. So, for example, we see Arab Americans in the healthcare system working as our doctors. We see them in law enforcement. We see them as judges in the courtroom. We see them as entrepreneurs. We see them servicing us from our local Dunkin' Donuts to running local bakeries. We see them in the arts. We see them in the performing arts. We see them as community counselors, as therapists, as community advocates. We see them in every profession that you can think of. And historically, although Arab Americans many times went into entrepreneurship and businesses, we see a new generation of educated, young, vibrant professionals that is changing the landscape of how Arabs are thought of in this country. I do also want to mention that there's many Arab American or Arab-run organizations in the Chicagoland area. This is not a comprehensive list. This is just a general list of a handful of organizations that come to mind when I think about Arab American organizations in Chicago. The photo here is of Mona and Fatma's daughter, I believe her name is Iman, in the white scarf, who's a former Moraine Valley student. And these women participated in a resource fair that my department, Learning Enrichment and College Readiness, hosted a few years ago, in which we invited local community organizations and services to our Moraine rooms, and we held a big resource fair for our students here on campus. And it was a huge success. We had a great turnout. We're hoping now that the pandemic is slowing down a bit, hopefully staying positive, optimistic, that we're able to do it again in the future. But one of the organizations that participated was the Arab American Action Network, in addition to also some of the other ones listed here, the Adin Center, which is a Yemeni run community organization based in Bridgeview, Arab American Family Services, and also the Syrian Community Network. I actually used to work many years ago at the Arab American Action Network, and Muna, who's on the far left side, and I used to teach ESL together. So that's when I was first introduced to literacy programming and state-run literacy grants. And the classes that we taught were mainly for women. And the reason why they came to our class at a community organization, let's say, you know, as opposed to maybe a class at the college, was because they felt comfortable being served by a social service agency where they can also find other resources, and also because our classes were all women. So that was a really great experience. I very much enjoyed teaching side by side with Mona, and they've remained as partners with our department as we continue to serve ESL students here at Moraine, and they're a great resource for those of you that might have students that need some assistance from social service agencies. In addition to some of those agencies that do social services, there's many professional organizations, some of which are listed here: the Arab American Bar Association, there's an Arab American Engineers Association, there's an Arab American Police Association, there is the Arab American Business and Professional Association, which all have chapters here in Chicago and are very active in the community. There's also an Arab American Medical Association. You can visit any local hospital here, Palos Hospital, Christ Hospital, and you will find many Arab American doctors that have been serving our communities for a very long time. And they have a very expansive medical association in which they run here in Chicago, and also give scholarships to local students, which is great. So my speed talking has brought me to towards the end of my presentation, and we're going to have a little bit of time for Q&A, but I wanted to end my presentation not with a personal story, but with a story about Ronnie Malley. Ronnie Malley is one of our new class of 2022 Alumni Hall of Fame inductees. And Ronnie is also a friend of the college and a friend of mine. And I just had the pleasure of seeing him last week at a conference in which he performed for the Arab American Studies Association. And Ronnie and I were just talking about, you know, the community in Chicago. And I told him I had this presentation coming up and about the class I taught at St. Xavier. And he started to tell me more about his family story that I did not know. And I thought it would be nice to wrap up by sharing this story, because I think it's a really classic Arab, Palestinian, American Chicago story. And I'm going to read it to you because I want to make sure I don't miss any of the details that he shared with me. So please listen closely. I want to tell you a little bit about the Ma'ali family. And I want to thank Ronnie for sharing this with me. So he said, the extended family, his Halim family, came from Batunia, Palestine in 1893. Some of them, excuse me, some of them fought in World War I. The first Malis, or Ma'ali, Murshid, and Saleh Mali family members came in 1911 and worked as peddlers, joining the growing Arab population near 18th Street and Michigan Avenue. My great-uncle Musa Ma'ali then came in the mid-1930s and joined the U.S. Army to fight in World War II. Musa's son Rasim went on to become a career chief master sergeant in the Air Force and did a tour in Vietnam. He also served as an aide to Reagan to missions in Jordan and the Middle East. My grandfather, Abdurrahman, came in the mid-50s as a barber and eventually brought the family. My grandfather and his Batunia friends, Batunia is a town in Palestine in which many of our Palestinian community members come from. My grandfather and his Batunia friends started the Arab Women's Social Club, mainly women from Batunia, and eventually laid the groundwork to establish the Mosque Foundation, which became the Bridgeview Mosque. The sheikh of the mosque was Khalil Zayed, Miriam Zayed's father, and this is a very well-known family in our community. They were all involved in the community's establishing of social clubs, networks, and gatherings. Many generations later, people from Batunia are also doing that, but also remain connected to their culture and hometown in Palestine for over a century. And so I thought that was just a nice story to kind of wrap up on. Here you can see a picture of Ronnie. He's a musician, and now, as you can see in the photo here, an alumni Hall of Fame member, class of 1997, and his story shares the classic Arab American story of our community here in Chicago. They've been contributing for years. They come in waves, and heritage and culture, and passing that on generation to generation remains extremely important. So with that, I'd like to thank Troy for inviting me to do this presentation, the MVCC Library for hosting, the Arab American Action Network, and Dr. Luis Kankar for some of the data that I migrated into my presentation. And I have my contact information here if you want to reach out. I think we have a little bit of time for Q&A before we wrap up. And I want to thank you all for listening. Sorry I spoke so fast.
It sounded great. Thank you so much, Nina. And it didn't feel too fast. It was a lot of information, but it was really accessible. So thank you. So we have time for questions. Anyone in our audience, you can put questions either in the chat or in the Q&A, and we would be happy to respond back.
Also, if you want to share a story, I did notice that there were some what looked like Arabic names in our in our group here. So if there's some note or something about your family that you want to share, as I mentioned, I mean, this was a very general presentation, not comprehensive, but I hopefully gave you some insight into the community. If anybody wants to share something about themselves and their experience as an Arab living in Chicago, please feel free to do so. Thanks, Meg.
Yeah, so audience members are not able to speak, so you have to type out questions into the chat.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Set up like a webinar, so you have to just type in the chat. I don't see any questions yet, but one of the things I wanted to mention is that, you know, some of the topics that I glazed over are very heavy topics that really deserve a lot more attention, especially when we discuss discrimination, anti-Arab racism, and hate crimes. That is something that is, it's not specific to post 9/11 because these experiences existed pre 9/11, but there has been a huge increase of reported incidents post 9/11, and our community continues to fight against racism, discrimination, stereotyping. And so I, would be happy to have a more extended conversation on those topics in the future. Also, other topics that I mentioned, professional organizations, the contributions of Arab Americans in Chicago. These are also topics that we can elaborate on. The youth, the new generation of energy, the Arab American influencers now from Chicago. these are all topics that we also discussed in my class. And I think that it's great that there's a new generation of young Arab Americans, not only in Chicago, but across the nation and around the world that are using social media as a way to educate our, you know, our fellow community members and people everywhere about who they are, about their heritage or about their faith. I read something actually that someone sent me, might have been one of my colleagues in the office. It was about TikTok launching a Ramadan campaign where they want TikToks about Ramadan. And so, as many of you know, the month of Ramadan, the month of fasting, has started for us, for Muslims. And many of your students might be fasting. We ask that you are understanding during this time, that many of them might want to take the day off for their Eid celebration that will follow, and they have the right to do that. Please note that some of them might be tired in class or thirsty. Talked to Troy before this presentation. I told him I'm not hungry. I'm a little thirsty because my mouth is dry, but now I'm really thirsty. So as I said, we experience luxury Ramadan here in the United States where we have air condition and heat and plenty of food to eat. So I'm not complaining. But yes, please be understanding of your students who are observing Ramadan. And shout out to my colleagues that are here. Thank you for attending. I can see your names now. Bill, Carmela, Carol, Lauren, Meg, Omar, Peter, Rafif, Rory, and Safat. Thank you so much. And please reach out to me. I'd love to collaborate and continue these conversations offline.
So one question from Omar in the chat, who's covering this event, I think as a journalism student, is related to the goals for these kind of events. And I think maybe we could rephrase this a little bit because it's hard to gauge where we are currently in the midst of the event itself. But I know, Nina, over the years, you've been a real leader in organizing discussions and bringing people together and trying to help. In our community college district in so many ways is so segregated. There's pockets of people that live together, and Moraine is a place where we all come together. And maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the larger goals that I think the college plays, how you see your role in that, and how can we keep this? I think the conversation is never done, but how do we work together to keep these discussions and increasing understanding and making all of us appreciate the kind of diversity in our district? And that might be a big question, but you've been really such an advocate over the years.
Well, I mean, I think one of the main goals is to challenge the misinformation that is, so prevalent in the mainstream media and the movies that continues to work against our communities. So it's almost like an uphill battle. Like, yeah, we want to share who we are and our culture, and we want people to understand, but we also are fighting against this historic Western image of Arabs as terrorists and very Orientalist, kind of romanticized version of what it means to be an Arab or from the Middle East. We had a display many years ago. Troy, you remember this, you're a big supporter of this, of these huge banners that came from NYU that were part of a campaign called A is for Arab, and it was about demystifying the Arab, who the Arab is in media and in pop culture. So one of the reasons is because it's important to do this work or to maintain these conversations and continue to not only advocate for students, behind the scenes, but also to have students feel at home here at Moraine, to help them feel proud of their culture by providing a safe space for them to share who they are and to share this information and to invite speakers in who look like them and are sharing information about their communities, but also because we're challenging the vast misinformation that people are constantly bombarded with about who Arabs are, what the Middle East is, without getting into all the politics of that. This has been a challenge for our community for generations. And so that's one of the main reasons that motivates me to continue to do this work, to fight against that misinformation. We are part of the fabric of this community and this college, just like every other group. And somehow, even though many of us were born and raised in this country, we are still very much treated as if we are different, or we are experiencing some things that make us feel othered. Othered is a term that some scholars use to kind of describe the Arab American experience. You know, it's the not so white experience, that although we are counted as white on paper, based on the federal government data, we're not treated with that privilege. There's a lot of complicated issues that are attached to these discussions. But I think that it's important for us not only to have politically charged or politically motivated discussions when it comes to the Arab, Muslim, or Middle Eastern community, but also to have discussions that focus on the beauty of the culture and about the music and about the poetry of Arab Americans and the artists and the professional organizations. Because what most people know about Arabs or about the region of the Middle East is that it's an area that we've historically, as the United States, have been at war with. And so there's a negative connotation immediately associated with the region. And as was noted just in Ronny's story alone about the history of Arabs fighting wars for this country, being part of the military, many of which live in, continue to serve this country in present day. There's also a fine balance between, you know, contributing to this country in a way that you feel like you are an American, but also being very much aware of your Arab status or Muslim status if you are Muslim. And what we have found is that Arab Americans, regardless of Christian or Arab status, experience very much the same types of experiences and discrimination in this country. But many women who wear the hijab specifically, because of their visibility, experience discrimination at much higher rates than Arab males, regardless of faith status. So I'm not sure if that answered your question. That was a very long-winded, elaborate version of an answer, but it just goes to show you that these are complicated issues. And, you know, in a way, you know, they're complicated in a way it's like not that complicated. You know, it shouldn't take much for us to wrap our head around that, you know, discrimination is happening, and it's happening to a community that's historically, you know, contributed to this country and is part of the fabric of this country. And I think Bill was on this participant list. Our colleague Bill, if you're still in here, I just wanted to know, you know, Bill and I have had many conversations about his life growing up in Peoria and his many Lebanese neighbors and friends that lived in Peoria. And so yeah, you're still in here, Bill, I can see your name. So one of the things I wanted to note also is like the diversity in experiences. You know, the Lebanese community in Peoria had probably, you know, many of which I think were Maronite Christians, had a much different experience than perhaps Muslim Arabs from Lebanon or Palestine or Syria that are now living in what we call the Little Palestine area. And so we have, you know, if there's anything you walk away with remembering from this presentation, it's that Arabs are diverse in cultural norms, in their faith-based practices, and how they look. There's not a typical Arab look. We range in tone of skin and hair texture and eye color. And so just please remember that Arabs are a very, very diverse population, and their experiences are also very, very diverse.
I was so glad you shared Ronny's story. That's such a great story. And I've known Ronny for several years through different projects. So I send thank you to him for sharing that.
He's a great guy.
So I think that's probably a good point to wrap up. I want to thank you again and apologize to everybody for the link errors and getting into this talk. This will be posted online and shared, so we will send that out, and we'll get it to people who maybe weren't able to join us. So Nina, as always, thank you for your leadership and for sharing and giving us your time.
Of course. Thank you for having me, Troy. It's nice to have everybody join us today. Take care.